What if everything you were taught about human history is incomplete? What if entire chapters of our past were quietly removed, rewritten, or buried beneath layers of official explanation? Today, we are stepping into one of the most controversial historical narratives circulating in recent years, a subject that has ignited intense debate, skepticism, and fascination across the world. Before we go any further, I want you to pause and think. If evidence of a forgotten global civilization existed right beneath our feet, would we even be allowed to recognize it? Leave a comment with your first impression as this story unfolds. If this kind of investigation into hidden history intrigues you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement is what keeps discussions like this alive and uncensored. The story begins with a name that once dominated European maps, but has nearly vanished from modern textbooks: Tartary. From the 17th through the 19th centuries, European cartographers repeatedly labeled vast regions of Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of the Far East as Tartary or Great Tartary. These were not obscure maps drawn by amateurs, but official documents used by empires, explorers, and scholars. According to conventional history, Tartary was never a unified empire. It was merely a broad geographic label for lands that Europeans did not fully understand, inhabited by diverse nomadic groups, tribes, and cultures. Yet a modern reinterpretation challenges that explanation. Researchers outside mainstream academia argue that Tartary was far more than a vague regional name. They suggest it was the remnant of a highly organized, technologically advanced civilization that once spanned continents. According to this view, Tartary was systematically erased from historical records after a series of global upheavals. Maps were redrawn, terminology was changed, and the memory of this civilization slowly dissolved into footnotes and ambiguity. Supporters of this theory point to the sudden disappearance of the word Tartary from maps during the 19th century. They argue that such a dramatic shift cannot be explained solely by improved geographic knowledge. Instead, they propose that political reforms, imperial expansion, and centralized education systems played a role in redefining history itself. In this narrative, Tartary did not vanish naturally. It was replaced. One of the most provocative aspects of this theory lies beneath our cities. Across Asia, Europe, and even the Americas, there are monumental stone buildings that appear older than the societies officially credited with constructing them. These structures share striking similarities: massive stone blocks, precise symmetry, enormous domes, deep foundations, and advanced engineering that seems inconsistent with what is typically described as pre-industrial capability. According to proponents of the Tartarian narrative, these buildings were not constructed by local populations using primitive tools. Instead, they claim these structures are remnants of a lost global civilization that possessed advanced knowledge of architecture, energy, and materials. After its collapse, later societies allegedly inherited these buildings, repurposed them, and rewrote their origins to fit a new historical framework. Traditional historians strongly dispute this claim, attributing such architecture to well-documented movements such as neoclassicism, Baroque, and Renaissance revival. They argue that the engineering methods, tools, and labor systems of those eras are thoroughly documented. However, critics of the official explanation question why similar architectural styles appear simultaneously across continents that supposedly had limited contact. Another detail fuels even deeper speculation. Many old buildings feature doors, windows, staircases, and halls that appear unusually large by modern standards. Tartarian theorists argue these dimensions were not symbolic, but functional. According to them, these spaces were designed for beings of far greater height than modern humans. The idea of ancient giants, long dismissed as myth, suddenly becomes part of a larger pattern in their view. Photographs of towering doorways and oversized furniture are often presented as visual proof. The argument suggests that giants coexisted with humans and were an integral part of Tartarian society. Their disappearance, like Tartary itself, is said to have been deliberately removed from history. Skeptics counter that large dimensions served practical purposes such as airflow, public ceremonies, and displays of power, and that no verified skeletal evidence of giants has ever been confirmed. As these interpretations collide, a darker claim emerges. According to the alternative narrative, the erasure of Tartary coincided with sweeping educational reforms in the 18th and 19th centuries. School systems were standardized, historical timelines were simplified, and vast archives were allegedly destroyed through wars, revolutions, and mysterious urban fires. Supporters argue these events were not random tragedies, but convenient moments that allowed history to be rewritten without resistance. At this point, the question is no longer just about maps or buildings. It becomes a question of trust. Who decides what history is preserved and what is forgotten? And if Tartary truly existed as more than a name, why does its story provoke such strong reactions today? The deeper we go, the more unsettling the implications become, because Tartary may not be the only chapter missing from our past. If Tartary was erased, the next question is how such an erasure could occur on a global scale without leaving obvious traces. Those who support this narrative argue that the answer lies not in a single event, but in a sequence of coordinated transformations that reshaped the world between the late 18th and 19th centuries. This period, often described as an age of enlightenment and progress, may also have been an age of concealment. One of the most frequently cited elements is the sudden uniformity of historical timelines. Prior to the 19th century, local histories varied widely, chronologies conflicted, and regional accounts often contradicted one another. After major educational reforms, however, history began to look remarkably standardized across nations. Textbooks adopted similar timelines, similar interpretations, and similar points of emphasis. According to the Tartary hypothesis, this was not a coincidence, but a deliberate simplification designed to remove inconvenient narratives. Large-scale destruction of archives is another recurring theme. Fires swept through major cities across Europe, Asia, and North America during this same period. Libraries, universities, churches, and government buildings were reduced to ashes, often taking irreplaceable documents with them. Official explanations attribute these fires to accidents, warfare, or poor infrastructure. Yet alternative researchers point out how frequently these disasters occurred during moments of political transition, revolutions, and regime changes. They ask whether these losses were truly accidental or strategically convenient. The theory extends further into the realm of technology. Some claim that Tartary possessed an advanced understanding of energy, possibly using atmospheric electricity or resonance-based systems rather than combustion. Decorative elements on old buildings, such as metal spires, domes, and intricate rooftop structures, are interpreted not as ornaments, but as components of an ancient energy network. According to this interpretation, these buildings were not merely shelters or palaces, but functional hubs within a global system that once powered entire cities. Mainstream science rejects these claims, stating that there is no credible evidence of such technology. Still, proponents argue that the absence of evidence is itself part of the mystery. If Tartary collapsed through war or cataclysm, and its technology was deemed too powerful or destabilizing, why would later societies preserve knowledge they did not fully understand? In this view, destruction and reclassification would be the safest option. Another recurring claim involves catastrophic mud floods. Across many old cities, lower floors of buildings appear buried beneath layers of earth. Windows sit at ground level or below it, and entrances seem oddly sunken. Tartarian theorists argue this is evidence of a massive global event that covered cities in mud, forcing survivors to rebuild on top of the old world. They suggest this catastrophe may have coincided with the fall of Tartary itself. Conventional explanations attribute these features to urban development, rising street levels, and renovation over centuries. Yet critics argue that the scale and consistency of these buried structures across continents challenge the idea of gradual accumulation. They see a pattern of sudden burial followed by historical amnesia. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Tartary narrative is the claim that modern nations inherited the remains of this lost civilization and rebranded them. According to this idea, governments and empires occupied existing infrastructure rather than building everything from scratch. Palaces became government buildings, old energy systems were dismantled or misunderstood, and the original builders were removed from the story. This leads to an uncomfortable implication. Modern civilization may not be as young or as original as it claims. Instead of rising purely through innovation, it may have risen through inheritance, selectively acknowledging the past while concealing its true origins. At the center of all these claims lies a psychological dimension. Tartary has become a symbol for distrust in authority and dissatisfaction with official narratives. For many, believing in Tartary is less about proving every detail and more about questioning why alternative interpretations are dismissed so aggressively. If Tartary is nothing more than a misunderstanding, why does the discussion provoke such resistance? As the narrative expands, it begins to overlap with myths of lost golden ages, cycles of civilization, and humanity repeatedly forgetting its own achievements. And if this has happened before, the unsettling question remains, could it happen again? Because if Tartary represents a forgotten world, then what lies beneath our own foundations may be far more significant than we are prepared to admit. As the Tartary narrative deepens, attention inevitably turns to the people who supposedly inhabited this forgotten world. According to alternative researchers, Tartarians were not a single ethnic group, but a highly organized society that unified many cultures under a shared system of knowledge. They are often described as technologically sophisticated, spiritually advanced, and deeply connected to natural forces that modern civilization barely understands. In this version of history, Tartary functioned less like a conventional empire and more like a global network. Cities were allegedly designed according to precise geometric principles, aligned with stars, magnetic fields, and natural energy flows. Supporters of the theory argue that this explains why similar city layouts, star-shaped fortresses, and symmetrical urban designs appear across regions officially separated by vast distances and political borders. Star forts, in particular, occupy a central role in this discussion. These geometric fortifications are found across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Officially, they are explained as military structures developed to withstand artillery warfare. However, Tartary theorists argue that their design goes far beyond defensive needs. They claim the precise angles and repeating patterns suggest a deeper function, possibly related to energy control, resonance, or even communication. From this perspective, warfare explanations are considered a convenient cover story. Proponents ask why so many of these star forts appear in locations with little evidence of major battles. They question why similar designs emerged simultaneously in distant regions, long before global coordination was supposedly possible. To them, the forts appear less like improvised defenses and more like remnants of a standardized global system. Another layer of speculation involves language and symbolism. Some researchers claim that ancient symbols, crests, and motifs found on buildings attributed to different nations actually share a common origin. Eagles, suns, domes, columns, and obelisks are interpreted as symbols of Tartarian identity that were later adopted by emerging empires. Over time, their original meaning was allegedly stripped away and replaced with new national narratives. This reinterpretation also extends to religion. According to the alternative view, Tartary may have practiced a unified spiritual system based on harmony with natural laws rather than organized dogma. When new religious and political powers rose, this system was allegedly fragmented, repurposed, or labeled as pagan to justify its removal. The restructuring of belief systems would then mirror the restructuring of history itself. Critics argue that these interpretations rely heavily on pattern recognition rather than evidence. They point out that similar symbols naturally emerge across cultures and that star forts have well-documented military origins. Yet supporters counter that official explanations often address each feature in isolation, while ignoring the cumulative weight of similarities across continents. The Tartary narrative also incorporates the idea of selective survival. According to this view, not everyone from this civilization vanished. Some groups may have been absorbed into emerging nations, their knowledge diluted and controlled. Others, the theory claims, were marginalized, labeled as primitive, or driven into remote regions. Over generations, their true history faded into folklore and myth. This is where Tartary begins to intersect with legends of ancient builders, wise ancestors, and lost teachers found in cultures worldwide. From Central Asian epics to indigenous American stories, proponents argue that echoes of Tartary survived as distorted memories of a once greater world. These stories, they claim, were never meant to be taken literally, but they were never meant to be forgotten either. At this stage, Tartary ceases to be just a historical puzzle and becomes a challenge to modern identity. If humanity has already reached advanced stages before, then progress is not a straight line. Civilization may rise, fall, and be reset, each time leaving fragments behind for the next generation to misinterpret. And this raises a deeply unsettling possibility. If our current civilization is built on the remnants of a forgotten one, what determines whether we preserve the truth or repeat the cycle of erasure? Because if Tartary was not the first forgotten world, it may not be the last. As these ideas circulate, the focus inevitably shifts from the distant past to the mechanisms of control that shape perception in the present. Supporters of the Tartary narrative argue that history is not only written by victors, but maintained by systems that determine what questions are acceptable to ask. In this view, Tartary represents a boundary that modern institutions are unwilling to cross, not because it threatens a single historical detail, but because it challenges the entire framework of authority built upon linear progress. One recurring claim is that the 19th century marked a decisive turning point. During this era, borders hardened, nation-states solidified, and centralized bureaucracies expanded. Census records, standardized languages, passports, and property laws emerged almost simultaneously across much of the world. According to alternative interpretations, this was not merely modernization, but consolidation. A fragmented past was reorganized into a manageable narrative, one that emphasized national origins while obscuring older transnational connections. Maps, once filled with ambiguous territories like Tartary, were redrawn with sharper definitions. Names disappeared, boundaries tightened, and what could not be easily categorized was erased. Proponents argue that once Tartary no longer appeared on maps, its absence became normalized within a single generation. What is not taught, they say, quickly becomes unthinkable. Another controversial element involves population resets. Some researchers suggest that major wars, pandemics, and migrations during the 18th and 19th centuries dramatically altered demographics. They claim these events reduced or displaced populations connected to older systems of knowledge, allowing new power structures to rise without opposition. In this interpretation, chaos was not just destructive, but transformative. This idea feeds into a broader suspicion surrounding historical statistics. Census numbers, mortality rates, and migration records from this era often conflict or lack consistency. While historians attribute this to poor record-keeping, critics argue that uncertainty itself creates space for narrative control. If numbers cannot be verified, interpretation becomes authority. Architecture once again returns to the center of the debate. Many Tartary theorists argue that certain buildings appear suddenly in historical records, already fully formed, with little documentation of their construction. Grand cathedrals, government halls, and exhibition buildings seem to emerge as if they were always there. In their view, later societies did not build these structures. They inherited them and assigned new dates and purposes. World fairs of the 19th century are often cited as examples. Massive ornate buildings were erected in remarkably short timeframes, using materials and techniques that remain unclear. Official records claim they were temporary structures, yet photographs show stone, brick, and intricate detailing. Supporters of the Tartary narrative suggest these fairs were not showcasing modern achievement, but reintroducing remnants of an older world under the guise of progress. From this perspective, innovation becomes rebranding. Technologies attributed to the Industrial Revolution may have been rediscoveries rather than inventions. Knowledge that survived the collapse of Tartary, according to the theory, was slowly repackaged, patented, and attributed to individuals instead of civilizations. What appears as sudden advancement could instead be controlled release. The emotional appeal of Tartary lies in its implications. It suggests humanity is more capable, more cyclical, and more vulnerable to forgetting than official history admits. It frames modern society not as the pinnacle of development, but as a phase within a much longer, fragmented story. At the same time, critics warn that this narrative risks replacing evidence with suspicion. They argue that distrust alone cannot substitute for proof, and that questioning authority must be balanced with rigorous methodology. Yet supporters respond that methodology itself is defined by institutions that benefit from stability over disruption. This tension is precisely why Tartary continues to provoke debate. It exists in the space between curiosity and certainty, between imagination and inference. It invites people not necessarily to believe, but to doubt selectively and observe patterns that feel unresolved. As more individuals begin revisiting old maps, forgotten photographs, and overlooked details, the question shifts once again. Is Tartary a lost civilization waiting to be rediscovered, or a mirror reflecting modern anxiety about control, truth, and memory. Because whatever Tartary truly represents, its power lies in what it forces us to question next. As the discussion reaches this stage, Tartary stops being just an external mystery and begins to confront something internal, the way modern humanity understands its own past. For many who explore this narrative, the most disturbing aspect is not the possibility of a forgotten civilization, but the realization of how easily collective memory can be shaped, redirected, or erased. Supporters of the Tartary theory argue that history is fragile, not because evidence is rare, but because interpretation is centralized. They point out that most people do not discover history through primary sources, but through curated narratives delivered by schools, media, and institutions. In this sense, Tartary becomes an example of how absence itself can be persuasive. If something is never mentioned, it slowly ceases to exist in the public imagination. This leads to the idea that Tartary may have been deliberately transformed into a non-subject. Not disproven, not debated extensively, but quietly reframed as irrelevant. Once labeled as a cartographic misunderstanding, curiosity effectively ended. For alternative researchers, this is the most effective form of control, discouraging questions by making them seem unnecessary. Another recurring argument involves technological stagnation and sudden leaps. Proponents claim that humanity's technological curve does not appear smooth, but punctuated by abrupt advancements. They question how certain engineering feats, mathematical knowledge, and construction capabilities emerged so quickly once the industrial era began. In their interpretation, these were not sudden breakthroughs, but recoveries of lost understanding that had been suppressed or forgotten after Tartary's collapse. This idea fuels speculation that knowledge itself can be dangerous. If a civilization once mastered techniques that reduced dependency on centralized power, energy scarcity, or hierarchical control, then eliminating that knowledge would be a strategic necessity for emerging elites. In this view, Tartary was not destroyed because it was weak, but because it was incompatible with a world built on dominance and scarcity. Psychologically, Tartary offers a sense of reclaimed dignity. It suggests that humanity's ancestors were not primitive, helpless, or ignorant, but capable of harmony, innovation, and global coordination. For many, this resonates deeply, especially in an era marked by environmental crisis, social fragmentation, and distrust of authority. Believing in Tartary becomes a way to believe that humanity once knew a better path. However, this emotional resonance is also what critics find problematic. They argue that Tartary functions as a modern myth, filling gaps left by dissatisfaction with contemporary systems. When official history feels hollow or disconnected, alternative narratives rush in to restore meaning. From this perspective, Tartary says more about the present than the past. Yet even critics admit that the popularity of this theory exposes weaknesses in how history is communicated. Dense academic language, inaccessible archives, and institutional gatekeeping create distance between the public and its own past. Tartary thrives in that distance, where unanswered questions multiply. Another intriguing aspect is how the Tartary narrative evolves online. Each photograph, map, or architectural detail becomes a puzzle piece. Forums, videos, and discussions reinterpret evidence collectively, blurring the line between research and speculation. This decentralized investigation contrasts sharply with traditional academia, which relies on peer review and controlled discourse. In this environment, Tartary becomes participatory history. People are not just consumers of information, but active interpreters. Whether correct or not, this process reshapes how individuals relate to the past. History stops being fixed and starts feeling negotiable. As this movement grows, the reaction against it becomes more intense. Dismissal, ridicule, and censorship claims further fuel suspicion. To believers, resistance is proof of suppression. To skeptics, belief is proof of misinformation. The gap widens, and Tartary sits squarely in the middle of that divide. At this point, the question is no longer whether Tartary can be proven definitively. The question becomes more unsettling. If a narrative like this can capture the imagination of millions, what does that reveal about the stories we are no longer satisfied with? Because in the end, Tartary may not be asking us to rewrite history, but to confront why we are so ready to believe it has already been rewritten. At the final edge of this narrative, Tartary stands less as a destination and more as a threshold. After examining maps, architecture, symbolism, population shifts, and institutional control, what remains is not a single conclusion, but a confrontation with uncertainty itself. Tartary forces a question that modern society rarely sits with comfortably. How much of what we know is inherited truth, and how much is curated memory? If Tartary was merely a cartographic term, then its disappearance is a lesson in how language evolves with knowledge. But if its erasure was intentional, then it exposes a capacity for historical manipulation far greater than most people are willing to accept. Between these two extremes lies a grey space where doubt thrives, and it is precisely within that space that Tartary continues to live. The absence of definitive physical evidence is often presented as the final argument against this narrative. No verified ruins uniquely attributed to Tartary, no uncontested artifacts, no genetic markers that confirm a lost global civilization. And yet, absence alone has never fully extinguished belief. History itself is filled with cultures once considered mythical until evidence emerged unexpectedly. Supporters argue that discovery does not always follow permission. What unsettles many is not the lack of proof, but the consistency of unanswered questions. Why did architectural styles emerge simultaneously across continents? Why did historical timelines compress and standardize so rapidly? Why do so many old structures appear older than their official construction dates suggest? Individually, these questions have explanations. Collectively, they form a pattern that some find difficult to dismiss. Tartary also reflects a deeper human impulse, the search for origins that feel meaningful. In a world increasingly mediated by abstraction and authority, the idea of a lost civilization that lived in balance with knowledge and nature is profoundly appealing. It challenges narratives of inevitability and reminds us that progress is not guaranteed nor permanent. Yet there is danger in replacing one rigid story with another. Skepticism must remain paired with discipline, and curiosity must avoid becoming certainty without evidence. Tartary does not demand belief, but it does demand engagement. It asks us to read more carefully, to question gently, and to acknowledge how much of the past remains unknown. Perhaps Tartary is best understood not as a hidden empire, but as a stress test for historical confidence. It reveals where trust fractures, where institutions fail to communicate, and where imagination fills the gaps left behind. In that sense, Tartary is less about what was lost and more about what is missing from the conversation, and maybe that is why it refuses to disappear. Not because it was once a global power, but because it exposes a vulnerability in how humanity relates to its own story. When people feel excluded from history, they will search for it elsewhere, even beneath layers of doubt and speculation. So the final question is not whether Tartary existed as described, but why so many are compelled to believe it might have. What dissatisfaction, what silence, what unanswered curiosity fuels this revival? If history is a mirror, then Tartary may be reflecting something back at us, not a forgotten civilization beneath the earth, but a forgotten responsibility to question, to verify, and to remain aware that the past is never as settled as we are told. And perhaps the greatest discovery beneath Tartary is not stone or ruins, but the realization that humanity's story is still being written, not only by those who record it, but by those who dare to question it.